Hello and welcome everyone to Ananke's Festival of Literature. I am pleased to welcome Giti Chandra uh, uh, for this session, this amazing keynote session. So, welcome, Giti. A little bit about Giti. Giti Chandra is currently research specialist with Gender Equality Studies and Training Program under the auspices of UNESCO in Reykjavik, teaches uh, teaches at the University of Iceland and has been Associate Professor, Department of English at St. Stephen's College, Delhi. Her first book, Narrating Violence, Constructing Collective Identities, To Witness These Wrongs Unspeakable, published by Macmillan 2009, is a wonderful, groundbreaking, thought-provoking study that nobody reads. Well, I'm definitely going to read, Giti. However, the Routledge Handbook of the Politics of the Me Too Movement, published by Routledge 2021, has been getting attention, and a forthcoming 2025 co-edited book on transnational decolonial feminisms is shaping up fabulously. I'm loving reading this bio. She is the author she's the author of the Book of Guardian Trilogy, The Fang of Summoning by Hachette 2010 and 2010, The, the Bones of Stars, published by Hachette in 2013, and The Eye of the Archer, published by Hachette in 2020, and is unduly excited about the forthcoming 2026 book of collected poems. I think duly excited is the right word here. Her mostly sci-fi short stories and mostly sentimental poetry has been published in various amazing publications, including Tasavvur in 2024, the Gollanzs, if I'm not pronouncing it incorrectly, Kiti?
Gollanzs.
The Gollanzs Book of South Asian Science Fiction, volumes 1 and 2, published in 2020 and 2021. Althingi, if you can correct my pronunciation.
Perfect.
Okay. Althingi, The Crescent and the Northern Star, published in 2021. The Indian Quarterly, published spring 2021. And if you can definitely read this, The Polyphonia of
Yep.
Erelendum
It's
Upruna.
Icelandic. It's fine. You
All
don't
right.
have to.
All right. In 2021, Os Prasan 2019, 2020, and 2023, Quesadillas and Other Adventures, Food Poems, published in 2020, and Café Dissensus in 2018. Giti is trained but lapsed violinist and soprano, and has been a choral conductor for almost 3 decades. Wow. A proud second fiddle for the Delhi Symphony for over a decade, she points everyone to Leonard Bernstein's opinion that it is the most difficult instrument in the orchestra. She is still euphoric about her first joint exhibition of painting as part of the Umber Group in 2023. Giti lives in Reykjavik with her husband, 2 kids, a dog, and a cat. So,
And many books.
that's not the important part, but a really good part. But thank you so much. And I didn't know about the you being the choral conductor. That is quite amazing.
For years and years in Delhi.
Wow.
Almost 3 decades. Amazing stuff.
Wow. So with this, I'd like you to share your thoughts. Today's topic, I think, is really important and really critical. So over to you.
Thank you, Sabine, for this introduction. I sometimes feel that we take ourselves too seriously. There's no harm in in a little humor in one's long bios. So I want to begin, of course, by thanking Sabine and Namrata for putting together this absolutely wonderful festival of literature, and of course for inviting me to give this keynote. Thank you for all the effort and time and frankly sanity that goes into organizing something like this. In trying to do justice to the main concerns and concepts that this festival is focusing on, there are so many and they're so vital. I'm going to divide this keynote into five, but I promise reasonably short parts. I'm calling it Fantasies of Feminist Futures in a Violent World. And I'll start with how literature allows us in these very difficult and violent times to respond to the challenges and traumas of those times, taking the role of children in literature as my guiding point. And from children, I will move to young adults and look at young adult fantasy as against fantasy written for adults and what that has to do with violence. And this will lead me into a discussion of the representation and place of violence in fantasy as against in realist fiction. And I will use those ideas to think about what kinds of futures fantastical or speculative fiction allows us to build. And finally, I'll conclude with some thoughts on what kind of feminist futures fantasy draws for us. And through these ideas, I want to follow the thread of violence in our times and in our literature, and how fantasy, especially, but speculative fiction in general, allows us to understand the events we are witnessing and construct hopeful futures out of our dystopian presence. And so I'm moving to my first section, whose title I take from Shakespeare's Macbeth, which, of course, given its world-famous witches, is also a fantasy in some sense. And the quote that I've taken from Macbeth is, "I have done no harm." Children, innocence, and how literature helps me think about violence in our times. About a year and a half ago, I realized once again how literature allows one to think in unexpected and creative ways. And I want to present how I came to an understanding of how innocence and violence impact the discourse surrounding the events of violence that we are all living through nowadays, through a reading of a scene in Macbeth. Perhaps one of the most blood-soaked of texts, I've often wondered what the scene of Lady Macduff's little conversation with her child is doing in a play filled to the brim with graphic descriptions of battle and bodily violence. And this scene does little other than to introduce two unnamed characters, only to kill them immediately. That is Lady Macbeth and her son. And its function, to my mind, is to put forward a vital question posed by a woman, that is Lady Macduff, told to run from imminent death. "Whither should I fly?" she asks. "I have done no harm." In our still young century, already characterized by the mass migrations of people who have done no harm, women and children more than men, are routinely seen as innocent collateral damage. But what is this innocence that attaches to some and not to others, making some legitimate targets of violence and others not? What is its function in a discussion of violence? Coming in the middle of so much bloodletting in a world in which all hands are bloody, who, Shakespeare asks, are the innocent? Whose innocence makes bloodletting wrong, a moral evil, civilizationally destructive? In order to retain some semblance of morality and humanity, where may we locate our claim to innocence in a universe that offers us only amoral, politically sanctioned, power-fueled bloodshed? Not even in the women. For all that Lady Macduff claims she has done no harm, she acknowledges this earthly world where we do harm, where to do harm is often laudable, let me read that quote again. This earthly world where to do harm is often laudable, to do good sometime accounted dangerous folly. Who indeed is the innocent in a morally relativist, gradatedly complicit, foundationally violent, blood-soaked world? Perhaps the truly remarkable thing about this scene is the murder of a child on stage. Macbeth is often thought of as the darkest of Shakespeare's tragedies because there is no fool to speak truth to power. But perhaps its darkness lies in this physical killing of innocence. After this, there is only tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow. not a civilization worth saving nor humanity worth dying for. And perhaps it is this darkness that we stave off when we hold candlelight vigils for children killed in faraway lands and bear witness to each murdered child. Because while with his dying breath the child urges his mother to run away in this scene, we know that far away as their land may be, there is nowhere for us as a civilization to run, even if we have done no harm. The candlelight vigil and similar public mourning for innocents killed holds a space for a true, uncontaminated innocence that we cannot see in the real world. Its significance does not lie in its function as an exercise in sentimentality, but rather as a moment of faith in an unequivocal claim to civilizational humanity. It reminds us also that requiring that a human being be innocent in order to not be a legitimate target of violence is, in and of itself, a fundamentally uncivilized way to be. Undoing what we understand as humanity and civilization is, in fact, the work of violence. The image of the murdered child can be seen as a subliminal desire for civilizational innocence. And this brings me to the next section, in which I want to think about what happens when violence, especially the killing of the innocent, is produced as pleasure or entertainment, and talk about a best-selling fantasy series that became an incredibly popular TV series. And you might all have either read or at least seen some version of this, George R.R. Martin's Song of Ice and Fire that became the incredibly popular Game of Thrones series on TVs. This is my second section. I'm calling it Young Adult and Adult Fantasy Violence and Pleasure in Reading. It's not just about the number of people who die in G.R.R.M's adult fantasy saga. And in my limited attempt at humor, I call him Grim, like in Grimm's Brothers, because he is so grim to begin with. Or the fact that the most interesting ones die first, or even that killing everyone off seems to be rather more gruesome than it needs to be. It's also not that the realism that inserts death where it's least expected in life, as in fantasy, or that the deaths carry no meaning and life no sanctity, or even that death is not reserved for the evil and life preserved for the good, as in fiction it usually is. George Martin is pushing the fantasy envelope and so on. I get that. And the whole good versus evil thing is abandoned, maybe, and this keeps the reader on her toes and creates anticipation and such, and I get that too. But of course, any reasonably alert reader gets all of this in the first 200 pages or so. Or if she's particularly reluctant to abandon the dearly held verities of fantasy fiction, maybe the whole of the first book. The literary taste buds leap about in alarm and confusion, not quite sure what to make of all these unusual ingredients or the high-octane flavors. All excellent and good. But what then? What remains to keep these literary taste buds salivating and wanting more? Let's take a moment to consider what works for young adult fantasy. There's an evil villain, there are good kids supported by good grown-ups, there's a breakneck plot speed, all of this, yes. But also, there are pointy hats, there are flying broomsticks, there are wands, spells, magical animals, nameless or marginal evil persons, henchmen, women occasionally get blown up or destroyed by long-distance magic, but mostly death maintains such a genteel distance that any death of a named person is hailed and trembled at by the reader, with maybe an important character, or at most two, dying in a protracted grand finale. Tame stuff compared with the endless orgy of gore on display in the Song of Fire and Ice, and also the endless, well, orgies. Yet children as young as 8, hip young people in high school and college, middle-aged women and real men feverishly turn the pages and weep with nostalgia at the end of these young adult books. This might be an unpopular view, but Song of Ice and Fire / Game of Thrones has no real plot. It's built like an endless soap opera, the forward propulsion deriving from incidents and episodes rather than an overarching schema. It is my contention that what propels the reader through Grimm's scary tales is the violence. Not even the sex, just pure, unadulterated, disgusting, bodily expulsion of vital bits of itself. When people are not being killed or otherwise disemboweled in the service of a plot which could just move on as well without this, without this violence. Gratuitous images of violence litter the pages just because they can. In some violent adult fantasies, let's say the Hunger Games, you get more of a sustained plotline that actually promises a destination rather than simply an end to the road. But it is good to remember that whatever the larger schema of the trilogy may be, the Hunger Games trilogy, each book is driven by the steadily unfolding spectacle of the deaths of 25 characters, who indeed are in the book solely to die, leaving our heroine to proceed to the sequel. And that is the whole point of those books. We know that everyone except the hero and heroine will die. We're reading the book simply to discover how and how innovatively the author destroys them. And in that, we're no different from the good people of the Capitol in the Hunger Games who watch the Hunger Games on their TVs for entertainment. We consume gratuitous violence, which is made vitally more entertaining than otherwise because it is gratuitous. It is the plot. You could say that this is nothing new. Violence sells, gory violence sells even more, gory gratuitous violence sells best. The question is, what is it doing in fantasy fiction for adults? Why do the authors of these adult fantasy books assume that the same adult who tears eagerly through young adult classics like Harry Potter or Artemis Fowl or Percy Jackson needs the gouged eyeballs to make it through the Song of Fire and Ice? Well, of course, real adult readers read real adult books, even if they're fantasy, and therefore require real things like violence. And there's the rub, because as I will argue in the next section, even outside that most unreal of genres, fantasy, there is nothing more real than violence. So in this next section, I want to look at the relationship between violence, realism, and fantasy. You might ask why violence should be accorded the status of most real among real things. What does this status have to do with narrative? Or even if we want to push it a little further, what does narrative have to do with fantasy? It might seem a bit non sequitur, but one of the most foundational questions I came up against while working on literature and violence was this. What is the opposite of remember? It's a simple question. The answer, quite obviously, is also simple. The opposite of remember is to forget. The word forget comes from the root to forgo, to lose hold of. And if you think of memory as a series of linear links bound to each other, then losing or foregoing one of those links shows us how to forget, to forgo, is the opposite of to remember. But what if I said that the opposite of to remember is dismember? What then? What if we were to see the stories that we tell about ourselves as enunciating various kinds of selfhoods, identities? That these identities or narratives of ourselves and our lives are extracted from and built upon our physical bodies and our understanding of our physical bodies. That to dismember the body both metaphorically and literally dislocates our comprehension of ourselves and our world. In theorizing narratives and violence, emphasis is laid on the ways in which events of bodily harm disassociate from the storyline and form a separate and almost parallel strand in the text. This strand commands attention to itself as a distinct entity. It bends the narrative around itself, inviting the consumption of physical dismemberment as spectacle, human destruction as entertainment. It bestows gravitas where the plot cannot rationalize it by its mere presence. It confers seriousness and a sense of the irreducible contemplation of the human condition by forcing the reader to confront the dismemberment of the world, the word, the self, the body. It casts the text as constantly under erasure, always in danger of being sundered, rent, and rendered lifeless and without meaning in the absence of this violence. It is the most real. Without it, all is fantasy. It is adult. Without it, all is infantile. Once violence is introduced into the text, it abrogates to itself all reality and gravitas. It cannot then be removed, for fear of robbing that text of realism and a serious engagement with realities. This is part of its power in fantasy fiction, granting to that fiction the necessary coming of age that will mark it as adult rather than as young adult or children's fiction. But it does something else as well, something that is critical to fantasy fiction, adult or young adult. And in order to explain what this something else is, let's turn to a well-known fantasy series like Harry Potter for a moment. You hardly need me to point out that, in fact, violence plays a significant role in a story about a boy whose parents are murdered, whose face bears the scar of that violence, where another boy's parents are tortured to death, and imprisonment guarantees insanity, where detention means carving lines into your arm, where finally, through the increasing infliction of physical pain, evil finally confronts good with arms and fire in which children and adults die alike. And all of this lends a much required seriousness of purpose to the books. But it is not the most important part of the books. The most important part of the Potter books is the joy, the frisson of pleasure we derive from the moving staircases, the peopled portraits, the headless ghosts, the messenger owls, the creatures, in short, the pointy hats and wands, the magic. But adult fantasy is embarrassed at the prospect of broomsticks and abracadabra. Magic must not only be qualified as supernatural, but must also be subsumed into the natural fabric, where it is admitted at all. It cannot coexist with the normal, unmagical, and real world divided by platform number 9 3/4. And this has a couple of literary outcomes. First, adult fantasy is thus of necessity, almost always set in either pre-industrial or post-apocalyptic worlds. This is a generalization. I know there are exceptions, but as an idea. That is, worlds without science, which otherwise carries out the tasks of magic and is an alternative to it. In young adult fantasy, like Harry Potter, for instance, the muggle world of science and technology exists alongside but unaware of the witches and wizards. And this arrangement, which the adult fantasy writer is probably too embarrassed to inhabit, manages to create the all-important frisson of delight and pleasure from magic. Yes, but also because it is able to hold the gap between the real and unreal open in the principle of parallel worlds. The reader is allowed to inhabit both, so that keeping the grounded familiar of the real makes possible the wonder of the unreal or fantastical. The sense of wonder that is crucial to the fantasy genre can never thus be allowed to be normalized to the point of the familiar through the creation of a magical world or a world in which magic is taken for granted. And so the endless demands on Rowling for producing ever more and ever newer magical creatures and devices in her book, setting them in the context of the normal or real world as a constant presence, counterpointing the unreal and keeping the wonder of the unknown alive. And Rowling is known to have said that the real pressure on her was not so much the plot, but to keep creating these new magical creatures and devices in her book. In the pre-industrial or post-apocalyptic worlds of adult fiction, this pleasure is sought to be replaced by the more familiar one of sex and violence, producing not magical beasts and spells, but ever more graphic descriptions of ever more shocking instances of sex and violence. In settings that are stripped of the trappings of civilization, savagery is conveniently the norm. Remember, if it's pre-industrial or post-apocalyptic, this is pre or post-civilization. If such savagery is used, especially in adult fantasy fiction, to mirror a violent present, creating the enormous, flourishing genre of dystopian fantasy, what does the genre have to offer in terms of hope, resistance, and futures? And so I come to the fourth section, which I'm focusing around speculative fiction and the building of futures. Ursula Le Guin quotes a 15-year-old reader who says to her that she watches Star Trek because, I quote, that is a future she can live in. Some would say that that is the business of science fiction specifically, but much speculative fiction in general, to imagine a future we could live in. And moreover, that any imagined future is always fiction. In our assumption of a superior technology that we would not currently understand, it might resemble science fiction. In our extrapolating contemporary forces into the near future, we might think of it as speculative fiction. In that it is always the locus of our collective desire, it might approach fantasy. But Le Guin points us to the idea that speculative fiction's writing of the future is almost always a rewriting of the present or the past, and it is at this junction that I wish to situate my thinking on this issue and think about speculative fiction's imagining of the future. It's staking out the future as contested territory, fought for in the public and popular imagination. Why violence to the body is the battleground on which this war is waged, and what are the gains and losses of the literary strategies deployed by these narratives. Mark Ledbetter opens his book on victims and postmodern violence with an epigraph by Stephen Owen. I quote, "Body is earth, territory of violent metamorphosis and substitution. We are all in peril of becoming thing. The grotesque gap between our humanity and the thing, the body killed, damaged, wounded, is held open by metaphor." Unquote. I first came to this book when it was new, about 35 years ago, and I've thought about this idea in different ways since. I lean on it again today to think my way through the connections, territory, as Owen calls it, between violence, the body, language, literary strategies of narratives of violence, and speculative fiction. Lawrence L. Langer uses the phrase "the quest for analogy" when thinking about the breaching of the limits of reality or realism by events of extreme violence that renders systems of signification unstable and unreliable, vulnerable and volatile, leading to the abandoning of analogy. The quest for analogy, he says, whether by literary artist or historian, is the task that bedevils anyone aiming to initiate the imagination of an audience into the singular realm of the unthinkable. And in this case, he's talking about the kind of unthinkable violence that is being narrated. I would suggest that this is precisely the domain of speculative fiction, to find a system of significations beyond the limits of realism in order to represent the unrepresentable. You might ask then why so much speculative fiction has so much realistically described physical violence in it. It is, in fact, almost the only realist writing in speculative text. We might see that the being situated within a fantastical, speculative world allows the violence to exist within the confines of the fantastical, which allows it to retain its position beyond the limits of the real or the representable. In turn, it is both constitutive of the fantastical world, in the energy generated by terror, for instance, as well as destructive of it in its realism. Sadat Hussain Mantur, writing about the impossibility of writing the partition, acknowledges the inarticulacy inherent in such violence, claiming that his stories struggle with even as they illustrate the manner in which bodily mutilation results in the permanent mutilation of language. Kathy Carruth's pronouncement that silence marks the site of trauma alerts us to the vast realms of silence and the unspeakable that marks the present and our immediate past. In many ways, the compulsive urge to present and represent violence in speculative fiction should be a good indication of both its urgency as well as its impossibility. The representation of trauma and the pain consequent upon certain kinds of violence is both the urgent task of literature as well as its biggest challenge. As Elaine Scarry points out, eschewing the literal and material transcription of violence into literary text becomes a necessity rather than an option because of the inarticulable nature of pain. When cast into language or otherwise narrativized, Scarry claims the invisibility of pain is wrought first by omission and again by its active redescription. Thus, the analogic language found for events of violence often results in erasing the event rather than bringing it into being in language. How then to find a narrative that will adequately figure forth the unspeakable? Manter looks forward to a future in which, I quote, "the capacity to represent will be recovered." Unquote. If this is the future that speculative fiction imagines, then it is as well to remember Veena Das's suggestion that it is in the register of the imaginary that we will recover the narratives of violence. It is in this register of the imaginary that writers around the world, like Toni Morrison, Isabel Allende, and other non-realist writers, situate their narratives of violence, employing non-realist or magic realist tropes. Let us acknowledge here that any future that we might, as a species, imagine will be a future of imminent or possible violence. As Owen recognizes, we are all in peril of becoming thing. Our bodies and our individual and communal selves are always violence ready, always in fear of dismemberment. No genre recognizes this more fully than speculative fiction. Our next question, then, is how this future may be wrested from the grip of imminent violence. To think my way through this, I'm going to offer a theory based on a magic realist text, Isabel Allende's House of Spirits. If you will bear with me for a few minutes, I will offer a very truncated analysis of how torture works in the battle for the future between a fascist state and a militant rebel. I will demonstrate what I call the contract of violence between state and rebel and its connection to non-realist literary strategies. Allende's classic brings to the fore various kinds of violence, all of which she situates in their socio-political context, and all of which are written within a reasonably magic realist ambit. Then we come to the bit where Alba, the protagonist, who is a militant rebel at this point, is thrown into the dungeons of Pinochet's fascist regimes and tortured. The violence suffered by Alba is a part of the sacrifice that the resistance fighter is called upon to make, and which indeed she sees as her true calling. The relationship between the perpetrator and the victim is transmuted into the almost ritualistic bond between the sacrificer and the scapegoat or sacrificee. For both, the body, the depersonalized physical entity, becomes the site of the conflict. For the rebel, it is offered in sacrifice, and for the state, it is the physical destruction of the body which will destroy the spirit and thereby, literally as well as symbolically, the resistance. At stake, of course, is an attainable vision of the future, a desire for a reality which might never be achieved in our lifetimes, but is always desired, what you might call a deferred reality. The futures of speculative fiction seek to bridge the gap between desire and deferment that violence in our times forever holds open. And this is why a discussion of violence is fundamental to envisioning the future. The sense of the stolen future is so strongly situated in present violence that the writer must stake a claim to a future that she can live in. And in so doing, recover agency and signification in what Das calls the register of the imaginary. The literary strategies of speculative fiction confront the ways in which violence breaks and destroys language, enfolding the terrifying absence of the event of violence and constructing the silence of trauma. And these strategies allow the writer to access the site of trauma as non-real and fantastical, where realist writing employs image and metaphor. That comfortable displacement of the object onto another set of objects fails when confronted with bodily violence, leading the writer out of the real into the unreal, fantastical, speculative. So what kind of future does speculative fiction want, and what kind does it end up creating? If we had the time, we would discuss the tendency to create pre-industrial or post-apocalyptic settings that I mentioned earlier, and how these align with fantasy and science fiction, and why they manage to bypass the present in both cases. But if I were to take inspiration from some of my favorite science fiction writers, I would consider Ted Chiang's notion that speculative fiction is largely a matter of what he called thought experiments, where the premise may be fantastical, but once established, follows the laws of reality as we know them. Le Guin distinguishes between science fiction and fantasy and says that the strength of fantasy is that while, I quote, realism closes doors and shows us what is not possible, fantasy throws open a door or a window so you can go outside and see what is there. The future in science fiction, however, she considers as just a metaphor for now, through which we deal with past and present traumas. And perhaps that is why I see this desired fantasy future as one part eradication of past trauma and one part utopian desire. In this sense, it is always under erasure because the trauma is always already inscribed into the fantasy and the impossibility inherent in every utopia recognized. Perhaps this is why science fiction, for instance, which projects a post-war world, locates humankind's various anxieties in all the brave new worlds where every man has always lived, but no one has gone before. and find solutions and resolutions for them there. It is also in this sense that dystopian fantasy is so deep-rooted in contemporary fantasy, situated in the process of the eradication of past and present traumas rather than in the projection of possible utopias. In its desperate heroes, it recognizes this erasure of utopian desire, as well as its own inability to lay these ghosts of traumas past to rest. Fantasy, in particular, is often preoccupied with representing the present and recovering the lost or obscured or marginalized, thereby leaving the future an open prospect. This recovery of the obscured or marginalized, this listening to the unheard voices, is an interesting indication of what kind of progressive future speculative fantasy might be invested in. And so this brings me finally to my fifth section, which is fantasy, feminism, and the future. Writers who open those doors and windows that Le Guin talks about can see alternatives to how we live in our fear-stricken societies and imagine other ways of being, maybe even some real grounds for hope. As N.K. Jemisin says, let's start with the end of the world, why don't we? Get it over with and move on to more interesting things. Movements like Afrofuturism and African futurism, which create a past, present, or future in which Black people or Afrofuturist protagonists can imagine a reality beyond their current experience, critique contemporary realities, and re-examine historical events, make the construction of hope an active and urgent necessity. A student of mine once asked me in some frustration why speculative fiction did not create more feminist worlds, or futures in which the socio-political evils of the present did not persist. They can make up anything they like, she said. Why don't they? Of course, we discussed the processing of the violent present, its traumas and those of the past, and the need to find adequate representation for them. And we talked about some remarkable examples of emancipatory representation of gender. Tamsin Muir's Gideon the Ninth, N.K. Jemisin's Broken Earth series, among others. But if I were to think about a writer who foregrounds the strategies of undoing and rebuilding narrative to make it gender just, and using that as a foundation for positing a feminist future, I would go to Terry Pratchett's Monstrous Regiment. Without giving out spoiler alerts for anyone who's not read the book, it is a story of Polly, a young woman who dresses as a man to go into battle to look for her brother. As a premise, we know that this is hardly new, but Pratchett takes the title from John Knox's treatise of the same name, Monstrous Regiment, whose misogynistic worldview he uses as a kind of palimpsest for his novel. I should add that among the several novels written with this title and history, mostly by women, this is the truly feminist one. Pratchett demonstrates the socio-political, religious, and cultural roots of constructions of gender. And in the doing, he deconstructs the language that is emerged from these forces. At the end of the novel, the gender of Maledicta the vampire is left undisclosed. The reader is left wondering why, until one realizes that by this point, gender has been so undone as an imposition upon humans by society and history and ideology, that Maledicta's reveal is entirely inconsequential to anyone. One's gender, once so central to how the world perceives the identity of a person, is now completely inconsequential. So complete is the linguistic dismantling of imposed gender markers that even after we know that the uber male soldier Jackram is actually a woman. Sorry, there's a spoiler alert. The text continues to refer to her as him, which is his preferred pronoun. What does all this have to do with the future, Pratchett asks, or rather a newspaper reporter asks, quote, do you think the world would be a different place if more women were soldiers? Of course, Pratchett deliberately leaves actual speculation on the future unanswered, but Jackram does acknowledge to Polly, I quote, I expected better of them, really. I thought they'd be better at it than men. The trouble was they were better than men at being like men. They do say the army can make a man of you. So whatever it is you're going to do next, do it as you. Good or bad, do it as you. That is the future Pratchett is offering his characters. It isn't as if the adventures of the women have not changed the possibilities that the future can hold. But bad things would not remain stopped forever just because this is a fantasy. This isn't a fairy castle, Pratchett happily reminds us, and there's no such thing as a fairy tale ending. But sometimes you get to threaten to kick the handsome prince in the ham and eggs. And to kick or not to kick, that is now a choice. In the best feminist tradition, the present, practically as well as linguistically, has been transformed enough so that the future is a choice. And the monsters are still out there, needing a good kicking. Notions of utopia keep changing, Pratchett reminds us. After all, Thomas More's utopia had a strict penal system, with criminals becoming slaves, and those guilty of premarital sex were punished by a lifetime of enforced celibacy. The fantastical feminist futurescape at the end of Monstrous Regiment can be glimpsed through one of those windows that Le Guin claims speculative fiction opens. As Polly says, all we were given was a chance. No miracle, no rescue, no magic, just a chance. So I've spoken at length as an academic, but I have tried over the last 15 years or so to think of myself also as a writer, especially of speculative fiction. And I want to end with a mini rant about how hard it is to get the academic in my head to shut up while the fantasy or sci-fi writer is trying to craft futures we can live in. Why does fantasy have to have violence? This annoying academic asks. Aren't you afraid your books will lack gravitas if there's not at least one terrifying account of graphic violence in it? Physical violence, as we know, is by definition a spectacle, and a spectacle is by definition a thing to be consumed, which is the true meaning of entertainment. You know this. The reasonable academic reminds the confused writer and scoffs. No wonder your books don't sell like the Hunger Games or George Martin's. Or this, what? Your heteronormative, cis-identifying, exceptionally abled heroine is going to be young and beautiful with a perfect body and superpowers? Seriously? You're trusting the saving of the world to a hormone-fueled teenager when reality all around you is shouting at you that the real warriors are overweight, middle-aged women with backaches and not enough money. And so then the harassed writer needs to put down the pen and figure out how to represent violence without producing it as a spectacle for entertainment. How to create a villain that the reader will hate viscerally without having to describe that villain indulging in gut-wrenching violence. How to convey the gravitas of war and conflict without graphic accounts of what happens to the human body in that war. The writer grumbles and curses and decides not to use the woman's body as metaphor for absolutely everything from pleasure and joy to anxiety and fear and time and destiny. The writer shakes her fist at the academic, who smugly announces that if you took the woman's body out of the artist's reach, then that artist would really have to work her imagination to find suitable images for any and all human desire. The writer resigns herself to losing a sizable chunk of readership when the nubile and desirable body is replaced by the sturdy and middle-aged one. And so it goes. Agency is a cruel gift to give a writer, because the process of granting that agency to vulnerable bodies in her fiction is difficult and dangerous and very necessary. Thank you all for listening.
Wow, that was amazing, Giti. Thank you so much for that.